Hi, I like to post a couple videos a week. This one just happens that it will be posted on September 11th, 2025. So let's talk about a big national security issue that is not getting the press it deserves. It is food costs and a little bit more than that. Food costs have been getting a lot of press, but why it's happening, why food costs are going up and why they just don't seem to stop is really getting a shallow amount of coverage, and I think it would be smart to try and understand this a little more than we do. So, hi, I'm a small farmer. I have worked in agriculture for 29 years now, working with other farms on getting their logistics up and running, upgrading their operations, making sure they can stay current and keep up with changes in the economy and take care of themselves, make enough money so they can pay themselves, pay their workers a fair wage, and also take care of the land around them. Talking about money in agriculture can get kind of a bad rap because people go, ooh, money, isn't that what makes it evil? When you don't make money, you can't pay people. It's as simple as that. So the financial side of agriculture and food is really key to making the whole thing work. Making sure we have our financial ducks in a row and we have an industry that functions is also really key to making sure the country gets fed. And we're just going to talk about money and financial literacy like they're the very important things that they are, both in keeping sustainability going and just in keeping the country fed. All right, so the fact that food costs are going up in the US, that's not a secret. We've all seen it, we've all felt it at the grocery store. Why it's happening is way less understood. I did a video a few months back about how the monopoly cartel situation we have going on with eggs in the US keeps driving up egg prices. It'll be linked in the comments description below. When we talk about monopolies and big corporations and food, the thing we tend to laser focus on is how they don't have to be very competitive on price, right? If there's only one or a few companies you can get food from, they can raise up the prices and there's not enough competition to bring the prices back down. That is a very true, important, and accurate part of it. But we often stop there. There's actually a lot of other things that monopolies do that are very big problems, and we don't talk about those. So today we're going to get into that. We're going to talk about tariffs, of course, because people have a lot of questions. Of course, if food costs are going up right now, tariffs must have something to do with it. We're also going to talk about how we're importing a lot of food. The United States traditionally has focused on breadbasket type crops. I'm talking wheat, corn, soybeans, grains, and meat. We grow a lot of those, we export them to other places, and then in exchange, we import things like fancy French wine and tropical crops like tea, coffee, chocolate, things we can't grow much of here just because of our weather. That's been the US's traditional thing. Here's the problem. We're not doing that anymore. Our traditional strength in those breadbasket crops is falling apart. We are relying on imports for bread, beef, potatoes, basic breadbasket staples that the US used to be really strong on, and we're not even making those for ourselves anymore. So now we're importing those. So you would expect that if we're importing all this food, tariffs must be the reason the costs are going up. That's actually not as true as you'd think, because we import most of our food from Canada and Mexico. We import so much food from them that food from those countries is exempted from the tariffs. So yes, we're importing food. Yes, there are tariffs, but not on food. And so tariffs are not the reason food costs are going up, at least not for the bulk of the food we're importing from Canada and Mexico. The main thing I want to talk about in the US food system right now is coming from my years of experience working in the food system. And it's not going to be policy and tariffs and the big scale stuff that we're usually used to thinking of when we talk about food costs in this country. It's something a lot more personal, and that is incompetence, nepotism. These are things that are on full display if you've ever worked in agriculture and food. I hate to say it, but it's true. I've been really fortunate to work with a lot of farmers who take their job very seriously, treat it like a real job. I did a whole video about these folks. That video is linked in the description. It's a great overview of how taking a farm seriously as a business makes it more sustainable, makes it more profitable, obviously, and allows you to pay the people who work there properly. Taking farms seriously as a job is a beautiful thing, and it is actually kind of a weird thing to do in today's agriculture. So when we talk about the food system and how the lack of competition has made it worse, we usually focus on monopolies, which we should. That is absolutely happening. But what we don't talk about is how the lack of competition is also hurting our agriculture itself. A lot of US agriculture has become, in my view, as someone who's only worked there for 29 years, very uncompetitive. And how that happened and what we can do about it are things we really ought to spend more time thinking about as a country. Because a country like ours, it's one of the wealthiest in the world, with so much really high quality farmland that still somehow cannot feed itself, that's a big problem. That is a big failure on our part. Even though we're shooting ourselves in the foot right now, we're still one of the wealthiest countries in the world, with some of the best and most abundant farmland in the world. So if we're struggling to feed ourselves, that's a serious people problem standing in our way, and we should take that seriously. All right, so let's talk about monopolies. We're really used to thinking of monopolies as something that drives up prices, because they do. That's a very important part of what monopolies are about. Monopolies, like every business, just want to make more money while having to do less work. So we tend to focus a lot of that raising prices part, how they jack up prices, because that hits us in the pocketbook. We should also pay a lot of attention to that doing less work part. In the case of these egg companies here in the US that are kind of acting like little monopolies and cartels, they are jacking up prices, but they're also reducing supply. They are saying, hey, We own so much of the market that if we just stop making less eggs, number one, nobody can compete with us. Nobody's going to jump in and say, wait, I can make more eggs. There's just not enough other companies around to do that. So we can jack up prices, but we can also grow less eggs. We have to do less work. We have to feed fewer chickens. So they're making profit in two ways here, aren't they? They're jacking up prices, but they're also making less of the food. And because they have so much monopoly power in the market, they can do that and get away with it. There's just not enough people with the capital to jump in there and replace them in the marketplace. That's a really serious problem. So again, we're so used to focusing on the jack up prices part of monopolies, we also need to look at the do less work, make less products part of monopolies. Because when it comes to food, when companies just decide to make less, because it's good for their bottom line, that can get us into some serious food security issues. Usually when you have hunger, it's not because there's not enough food to go around, it's usually because people can't afford it. Well, let's go hand in hand. Companies just choosing to make less food because that works for their bottom line, especially when it's healthy staples like eggs, is a serious problem. And we should be paying attention to that part of it as well. But making less product is just one way monopolies can be lazy. There's another one that's really important to me as someone who works inside the food system. When you work at one of these facilities that's, grinding wheat into flour, you want the equipment to be up to date. That's for safety reasons. It's also for you getting paid right reasons, right? As wages go up, you have to keep upgrading your equipment to keep up with that. For example, in a place where living wage is 15 cents an hour, maybe you can afford to have people with a little hand mill, grinding wheat into flour with a couple of rocks. That could maybe work. But in a place where the wage is $15 an hour, you need people who are working there to be making more wheat than that, right? So how much work people can get done in an hour? It's called labor productivity. Because we've spent so long bagging on processed food and manufacturing, it has become very difficult for us to think in a sane way about how important it is to get better and better equipment over time so that your employees can get more and more done so you can afford to pay them a living wage. We've gotten so focused on how artisanal is good, and it's nice, don't get me wrong, but we've gotten so focused on that we've forgotten how you make staple food that's affordable for people, and that is by investing in equipment. As technology changes, and especially as safety standards change, and as the economic needs change, you're going to need different equipment. So for example, if I were to start a flour company right now, I could buy bags of wheat and put it into a very small mini mill. It might cost me $7,000, but it's a small mini mill, so I would have to stand there with a bag of wheat and just pour it in there every couple of minutes. I can't walk away. It can only grind through maybe 50 pounds of flour per hour. You can do it, but it's not a very good use of my time, right? So if we want to run a flour facility that's going to pay people a living wage, you might need bigger equipment, where one person can use a forklift to put maybe 1 ton of flour at a time into a much larger mill. That is going to let you pay that person more because they're getting more done with their time, right? So I know we've gotten really focused on how large-scale processed food is bad, but that's how you make staple food. Nobody's really been investing in that lately. Instead of investing in those facilities, instead of getting better and better equipment that can keep up with the cost of labor, I see a lot of food facilities that just built everything they had in the 80s and haven't upgraded anything since. These facilities are dangerous, they're dirty because everything's chipped and worn down, you can't clean it thoroughly, and they really struggled to pay a 2025 living wage because they were sized for the economics of a different time. That is something that monopolies tend to do. If there's no competitive pressure, if they're not feeling a need to keep up with competition, they're going to stop investing in equipment. And so that's something you'll see all the time if you work in agriculture and especially food handling. There are some facilities that are newer, but so much of our food infrastructure in this country was built, I swear we must have had some kind of building spree in the 80s, and a lot of things have just stagnated ever since. And I think that actually plays a much bigger role in our food system's problems than we think it does. We just haven't been investing in staple foods in decades in a serious way. And everybody who's wanted to get into food for the last couple decades wants to make something very niche and very luxurious to sell at Whole Foods, or I guess Whole Foods is now mainstream, so Erewhon, I guess. And so the staple, basic, fundamental food supply has gotten really neglected for decades now. That's part of why our food costs are so high. We're just not really keeping up with our country's needs. So that is one thing that happens when monopolies are allowed to do their thing. They jack up prices and they also stop investing in themselves. They don't really need to. The other thing that happens is people who have worked in monopolies for decades never learn how to be competitive at the job. Right? So it's not just the monopolies choose not to do this work. At a certain point, they lose the ability to, because no one working there has ever had to try hard at their job. When you have a whole country where so much of our food system is monopolies and big corporations that haven't really had to compete, you wind up with a lot of incompetence. People constantly complain about how food safety regulations are impossible to keep up with, which is banana pants. We're not trying to go to the moon here, people. Everyone in food facilities who's in charge of following all those food safety regulations, a lot of them never graduated high school. A lot of them don't speak English, and they're still able to do the job. So to hear people who've been in this country forever and had the benefit of education insist that it's impossible to keep up with this, that's crazy. That is that's not a reflection of how hard the job actually is. That is a reflection of their willingness and their experience with actually putting in the work. The US has been doing a couple things over the last few decades to strengthen monopolies. One of them, of course, is we're not trust busting anymore. The other one's a little more obscure. A lot of the big companies in agriculture are not corporations the way people usually think. They're not big shareholder-owned corporations. They are family companies. They just happen to be rather large. The family who owns them happens to be rather wealthy. They're not shareholder-owned corporations. They're family businesses that just happen to be large. So the fact that we're not trust busting really helps the classic corporations. But you know what's really helping the big family businesses in agriculture? We stopped doing estate taxes. We really pulled back on that because rich people complained so much that it was working. So we're really used to talking about how monopolies keep companies from having to be competitive. But the same thing happens with family businesses when we don't have an estate tax. I really believe that wealthy people need to have some pressure to use it or lose it, and that's what estate taxes do. If you don't do that, then the next generation can just slide right in there, not having necessarily developed the skills, not knowing what they're doing, and just write it out for their whole life. And when you work in agriculture, when you work in food handling, you really see the consequences of that. It's kind of wild. I am in agriculture, but I'm a Democrat. And when people know that about you, they'll kind of treat you like they're a confessor. The number of people who work in agriculture who publicly are very conservative, who have said to me, we really need to bring the estate tax back because they see the consequences. They spend their lives working for people who don't really know what's going on. They just inherited everything they have. Big family businesses, big family farms. Most of the quote unquote corporate farms in this country are family farms. That's a really tough truth to swallow. I think we call them corporate farms because that's easier than facing what's really going on here, which is that a lot of families are willing to treat their land and their neighborhoods quite badly. We've really built our farm policy around saving family farms because it sounds so nice, right? But what that has really done is kind of created a monster. Family farms are no longer poor. I think that's the thing people are really misled on. So we should talk about wealth in agriculture really quick. Most small family farms at this point are millionaires, and they also make a lot of money per year. The median household income for small family farmers is a lot bigger than for non-farmers. And family farmers, have made more money every single year than non-farmers since 1998. Every single year since 1998, and that is after you take out farm debts and expenses. Farmers in the US are not poor people. And I know that can really surprise people because we're used to thinking of them that way. What happened is we had a century where, small, struggling, poor family farmers were getting kicked out of the business, getting pushed out. Well, after you do that for a century, who's left? We talk about how, family farms, sometimes they lose money for years in a row. Let's ask ourselves who can afford to keep doing something that loses money for years in a row. It's not poor people, is it? So that's a really important truth to understand about agriculture. In our very well-meaning excitement to save family farms, we've really created a monster. And again, I've been really fortunate to work with a lot of family farmers who take their job seriously, who know what they're doing, who really put the effort in. They are fantastic. I like them so much, I made a whole video about how great they are. Nobody watched it. But I want to make it clear that you don't have to take your job seriously to keep your farm. People deserve to know that farmers who take agriculture seriously and treat it like a real job are really a minority in agriculture at this point. Because of how much safety net we've put in place for family farms, a lot of people have really absorbed the idea that they're too important to fail and have come to see agriculture as not a job, but it's a lifestyle. You'll actually hear them say this. It's not just a job, it's a lifestyle. So a lot of the people who are born into agriculture today in the US don't view it as a job. They view it as a lifestyle that they are entitled to. And I'll point out here that agriculture is an expensive lifestyle. And these people feel entitled to it. So if you're wondering how it is that we have farmers who voted for this guy, even though they knew he was going to do things that would wreck their business, and now they're acting surprised, and now they're saying, oh no, we got lied to. This is how that happens. A lot of people in agriculture, a lot of our farmers in the US, think agriculture is not a job. They think it is an expensive lifestyle that they're entitled to. They think they can do whatever they want. They can shoot themselves in the foot. And then the American taxpayer owes it to them to bail them out. That is truly the mindset that we have in a lot of the US farm sector right now. And it hurts to watch because agriculture is not hopeless. It's not doomed. There are a lot of good opportunities in agriculture. But time and time again, I see my colleagues, most of whom were born into this life, look at these new opportunities, think about the work it would take to pursue them and make them real, and they just go, oh, that's too much work. It happens all the time. And it is hard to watch because we have made it so hard for these people to fail that it's actually very difficult for new people who do have the will and the skills to put land to work and to grow things that people actually want. They can't get in because so much of our farmland is being treated as a game preserve for people who view farming as a lifestyle that they're entitled to. Last but not least, we need to talk about how the US isn't even really growing its own food anymore. We've talked about what's going on in the food sector, now we're going to talk about the consequences. So our traditional approach was grow the breadbasket crops, export those, things like grain and meat, and then import things like fancy French wine, chocolate, coffee, tea, things that don't grow well here just because of our climate. That is breaking down. The US is now importing the breadbasket staples. Things like beef, we're importing. Things like potatoes, we're reliant on imports now. Like ketchup, we're importing that now. The one type of crop the US has always been really strong on, grains, oil seeds like soybean, we're importing most of those now. This is really, really bad. And it's so inside baseball to the agricultural world that I don't think people understand what a mess this is. Again, this is not a problem because of tariffs. Most of the food we're importing comes from Canada and Mexico. Food from Canada and Mexico is exempt from the tariffs. Here's where it can be a problem, though. We are ruining our economy right now. It's going to drop the value of the dollar. That means it's going to take more of our dollars to buy the same amount of food from Canada and Mexico. Some food trade is good. You can't grow everything yourself. I don't think full self-sufficiency as a country should be a goal. But when you have a country like the US that is wealthy, that has a lot of skilled people in it, and has some of the best, most abundant farmland in the world, and we can't even handle growing our own staple crops, that's crazy. We have a serious problem. It's not something we really talk about, again, because it's so inside baseball. I hope I was able to walk you through some of this stuff here just now. But this is a mess. Really disappointing, obviously. And the more we rely on imports and the worse our economy gets, the more food prices are going to spike. And that's going to hit the poorest people the hardest. When people go hungry, that's usually not from lack of food. There's usually plenty of food around. It's just expensive enough that the poorest people can't afford it. And especially since we already cut a lot of food benefits, that can get pretty ugly pretty quick. And unfortunately, there aren't a lot of short-term fixes to this. We have spent decades getting ourselves into this hole. And we got here because the path we took to get here really fit with our biases of how we think the world should work. We got here because we tried to save family farms, right? So pulling out of this is not just about we need to do policy differently. It is about we need to think about agriculture and food differently. And that is really hard to get people to do, especially in a time like right now when everything's on fire. But I just wanted to get that out there. And hopefully this will help people also make sense of what is going on in agriculture. Why do we have farmers who keep supporting people who destroy their business and they keep voting for them? It's kind of hard to escape the role that incompetence plays in that and the role that entitlement plays in that. And I think that's something that if the US farm sector wants to survive, we're really going to have to face and stare down and figure out what we're going to do about that, because the way we're heading, it's not getting better until we really change some things about how we do this. All right, that's enough for me for now. If you're still watching this, thanks for making it to the end. Also, if you like what you're learning here, please go ahead and give it a like, a subscribe, a comment. Things like that really help this information get in front of more people. And if you really, really like it, I have a Patreon with some bonus content. With the kind of content that I do, I am definitely not getting sponsorships from food or agricultural companies. So Patreon really helps this information keep getting out.